The Prime Minister is pushing back against the allegations that one of his MPs has been compromised by China. That was reported by Global News over the weekend.
Han Dong is an outstanding member of our team, and suggestions that he is somehow not loyal to Canada should not be entertained.
But as Trudeau defends that member of Parliament, calls are escalating for a public inquiry into how and to what scale China interfered in Canada's elections. The Prime Minister says his preference is to deal with the issue at a parliamentary committee. So, is a full public inquiry needed? We're going to discuss all of this with some members of Parliament. Mark Gerritsen is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader. Michael Cooper is the Conservative Democratic Reform Critic, and Peter Julian is the NDP House Leader. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Mr. Gerritsen, there's a growing chorus of calls from people partisan and non-partisan for a fully independent inquiry into these allegations of foreign interference in Canada's elections. Are you prepared to do that, to take the partisanship out of this?
Well, I mean, I think that our goal has always been to keep the partisanship out of this, quite frankly. I mean, when you look back at what we have done since 2015 with respect to ensuring that our elections are conducted in a fair and transparent way, we've introduced a committee of parliamentarians that get full access to looking at the top classified documents in terms of what's going on. We've also established a panel that looks at our elections during a writ period and makes sure that elections are happening in a fair and open process. So a lot of that is already in the works. And I would say, you know, to add to that, in terms of, I've heard the calls for the public inquiry. I would say we are having public meetings about this. Mr. Cooper and I are both on a committee together that is meeting several times this week, open and in public, with experts coming before us to answer these questions that parliamentarians have. So I don't think we really have to wait much longer than just listening to what unfolds this week in terms of getting the answers to the questions that Mr. Cooper, Mr. Julian, and others have.
Mr. Cooper, I mean, no disrespect to members of Parliament and the fine parliamentary committees we have, but they sometimes devolve into partisanship talking points and partisan attacks and don't necessarily get Canadians all the answers they're looking for. Do you think your committee is the right venue for this, or should it be a more robust system like a proper public inquiry?
Well, we need to keep all options on the table. But that being said, there is a committee process right now. The PROC committee is studying this interference. And one of the problems has been that the Liberals, with the support of the NDP, have blocked the production of relevant documents, shielded ministers who held relevant portfolios at the time of the 2021 election, and have shielded PMO staff, including the Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, from coming to committee and answering questions. We need to hear from the PMO, especially in light of the latest shocking revelations reported by Global News, that PMO staff were briefed by CSIS that a Liberal candidate and now sitting Liberal member of Parliament was assisted by the Toronto consulate, the CCP Toronto consulate, in his nomination campaign, and that they turned a blind eye to it. The PMO, including Katie Telford, cannot run and hide. She has to come before committee and answer questions.
Now, I know you tried to get Ms. Telford and others to committee last week, and it was amended, but you voted for that amendment. That dropped her from the list last week at committee, correct?
I voted for the motion so that we could expand the scope of the study, but I said very clearly the Liberals and the NDP had gutted our motion.
Okay, Peter Julian, now, given this other reporting, and we should point out there has been some pushback against the global reporting. The Prime Minister today was emphatic in his support for Mr. Han Dong, who is the candidate in question, saying his loyalty should not be besmirched by reporting. And there's also been pushback from people like Richard Fadden, the former head of CSIS, saying that they never would have advised the Prime Minister's office not to allow a candidate to run because that's not what CSIS does. So given all of that, do you think you need to broaden your committee's work even further to include people like Ms. Telford and other members of the Prime Minister's staff?
Well, Jagmeet Singh was clear yesterday. We need a national public inquiry. These are serious allegations. These are the kinds of allegations that we saw come to fruition, sadly, under the Harper years with the in-and-out scandal with Dean Del Mastro, who ended up going to prison. The allegations really are getting around the Elections Act that is supposed to govern free and fair elections in this country. And both Liberals and Conservatives are involved. Mr. Cooper, I think, makes a strong case for the National Public Inquiry because the Conservatives have refused to admit that Conservatives have been involved in this scandal. And so we need to come to the end of the allegations. We need to find out what the facts are. And a national public inquiry that is nonpartisan in nature is the best way to achieve that.
What do you mean by involved, sir? I know there is reporting that both Liberal and Conservative candidates may have been favored by China, but I've yet to see, outside of the allegations in the Global Report that have been refuted and denied, of anyone actually being involved. They may have been affected by it, but there's no active involvement. I just want to be clear on that. That's not what you're saying, right?
I'm saying that there are allegations, and to look at those allegations to see to what degree there has been involvement, it has to be a priority of every member of Parliament. We need to make sure that we are all satisfied that elections in Canada take place free and fair from foreign interference. We've seen the sad example of the collusion that took place in the 2016 election that elected Donald Trump in the U.S., the Russian government agencies allying themselves with the Conservatives around the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. These are serious allegations. They need to be treated seriously, and Mr. Trudeau needs to put in place a national public inquiry.
Okay, Mr. Garrison, then Mr. Cooper.
If I can jump in quickly, it's not that anybody doesn't take these seriously. We all take them seriously, and I believe that everybody on all MPs take this seriously. Listen, this is we're talking about our democracy here. This is something that should be nonpartisan, and we should definitely not be looking for political angles on this. The reality of the situation is that do we have the processes in place right now to watch and monitor this stuff? And my suggestion to you is that we do. We have that with a special group that gets together, a special panel of experts that monitors our elections during the writ period, provides a report. A third party provides a report to that afterwards. We also have a special committee of parliamentarians that gets all documents unredacted, that has oversight on this stuff. So it's not that we don't believe in ensuring that the public has their opportunity to look at this stuff. It's the venue in which Mr. Julian and Mr. Cooper are suggesting that it happen that I think, we already have something in place to deal with that stuff.
I want to let Mr. Cooper in here, then I want to come back to you, Mr. Garrison, with a question. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, when it comes to the 11 candidates, we have called for the names of all of those 11 candidates to be released. We have called for transparency. It's why we put forward a motion at PROC to have the independent parliamentary law clerk redact the relevant documents to take into account national security issues and considerations. The Liberals instead wanted themselves to redact the documents, and we think that that's a problem. That isn't transparent, and right now there is no document production.
Come on, Michael, you know better than that.
One at a time, please. One at a time, Mr. Garrison. One at a time, please.
Katie Telford is being shielded, even though we now have reports that senior Trudeau staff were warned by CSIS that a candidate and now sitting MP may be compromised by Beijing. That is very, very serious. And not only that...
Mr. Dong denies that, and the Prime Minister was emphatic today that they trust this guy, and it seems like they would be prepared to let him run again. What does that say to you?
It gets even worse, because according to the Global News Report, there were two sources that this classified information, a classified briefing, was then in turn leaked to Han Dong, which raises issues of not only conduct that's completely inappropriate, conduct that undermines our national security, but may have crossed the line into breaking the law. It's all the more reason why we need answers, we need transparency, and this Prime Minister and this Prime Minister's office can no longer run and hide and be shielded.
Okay. So Mr. Garrison, on this point, right, we are dealing with intelligence that is protected by the national security laws and national security regulations. And the Prime Minister's office is in a situation where they can neither confirm nor deny certain things because of the constraints of the national security laws, and this puts them in a difficult position politically. So given all of that, why don't we move it away from partisan political committees and go to a public inquiry, as people like Richard Fadden and John Pierre Kingsley and other people who are not partisans, but experts on elections and experts on national... I don't know if Mr. Singh's an expert on national security, but the former head of CSIS certainly would be. Why not just go in that direction?
Well, because two things. One, I would say that we already have a panel of experts, nonpartisan experts that include civil servants, that include individuals who understand and know how to deal with these situations.
Okay, but that's a site task force. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to, that exists only for the writ period. That committee exists only for the writ period. This is now a much bigger issue that goes beyond elections, right? And this is
They also reported back after that election that the results of that election were done in a fair and transparent and process that was valid and had no interference in it. So I mean, there's that, and then there's also the fact that parliamentarians do have access to this top secret information through that National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians.
Well, what about Canadians?
Mr. Cooper's colleagues, a couple of his Conservative colleagues sit on that committee. They have access to that information. So do the NDP. So to suggest that the information isn't available, I think is not completely true, because it is available, but it's done in a way that respects the classification of that information.
And I totally can take your point that the NSICOP, whatever the acronym is, that MPs have access to that information. But Mr. Julian, what about Canadians who might be concerned about this? A public inquiry, and like the secret committee, not secret committee of MPs, the committee of MPs that get secret information, they get it. They don't do necessarily a big report that we get to see where we can assess this. And it feels
the oversight.
They provide oversight. I understand that. But Canadians want to have confidence in their elections. So, Mr. Julian, given that, and given that China is escalating on this, and it's more than just China, I mean, no less a liberal than Jerry Butts has advocated for the need for this. So where are the gaps in the current oversight that you think need to be fixed?
Well, I think a national public inquiry would indicate to what extent the Elections Act needs to be toughened up even more. But the allegations are serious even within existing legislation. And that's why it's so important to actually get answers for Canadians on this issue. These allegations are serious. We saw this under the Harper government with the In-N-Out scandal and the Dean Del Mastro scandal.
That has nothing to do with the China issue. Mr. I appreciate that, but that has nothing to do with China. Right? That has nothing to do with foreign interference.
It is everything to do with the Canada Elections Act, and our biggest concern is that the Canada Elections Act seems to be potentially violated. These allegations speak to the violations of the Canada Elections Act, and it needs to be treated seriously.
Mr. Cooper, quickly.
This is a lot bigger than the Canada Elections Act. This is about reports that Beijing tried to interfere in 2 elections and in the 21 election to try to tip the scales in certain ridings in favor of the Liberals and against Conservatives. And now we have reports that senior Trudeau staff were briefed by CSIS that one of their candidates, now a sitting MP, may be compromised. The Prime Minister has a lot to answer for. We can leave all options on the table,
but can he even answer these questions at this committee if national security laws still apply?
There is absolutely no reason why he can't come forward and tell Canadians whether he was briefed, whether he knew that Han Dong may have been compromised by Beijing, and ignored that advice and gave green light for him to run in.
I think his answer today pretty clearly said he doesn't believe he's compromised. And Mr. Garrison,
then he can come before a committee and say that.
But Mr. Garrison, a final word to you. Can the Prime Minister even answer that question at committee, given the restrictions placed on him by national security rules?
Well, that's a really good question. But, listen, despite all the rhetoric that's going on around this, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that the last election, the election before that, were elections that were decided by Canadians and Canadians only. To suggest that the outcome of the election was done and was influenced in any other way, I think is disingenuous, and it really hits at the heart of our democracy. Yep. Listen, we're all interested in getting to the bottom of understanding where foreign interference is. I think it's just about how we do it, where our differences lie.
Okay, and just a final point for me, and we're going to leave it here, but I think all the parties have made it clear they accept the results of the last election. They don't think the total outcome was affected by this, but the next election is also a concern as well. I've got to leave it there because I'm out of time. Mark Garrison, Michael Cooper, Peter Julian, thank you so much, gang.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Calls are mounting for a public inquiry into alleged Chinese foreign interference in Canada. This after Global News and the Globe and Mail have reported China targeted both the 2019 and 2021 elections. Those reports cite intelligence documents and unnamed sources. A House committee is studying these reports, but my next guest says that likely won't be good enough. Jerry Butts is the former principal secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He is currently the vice chairman of the Eurasia Group. Jerry Butts, welcome back to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here, David. Congratulations on the gig.
Thank you, sir. You agree with the calls for a public inquiry into this issue of election interference. What led you to this point, to this conclusion?
Well, I don't know what kind of inquiry it is, David, but I think it's really important that Canadians maintain their justified confidence in their democratic institutions. And sometimes the only way to do that is to pull it out of the realm of partisan politics and hand it over to people who are seen as above that particular activity in our country, and have them take a look at all of these things and tell us, A, what we ought to be doing that we're not doing, B, what actually happened in the circumstances that are currently being mooted, and C, and I think this is most important, reflect on the changing circumstances of the world. We have a very different geopolitics. It's what we at Eurasia Group do for a living, of course. We have a different geopolitical environment than we did even 3 to 5 years ago. So it stands to reason that these threats would be increased on Canadian democratic institutions.
Right, because you've made the point that this is about more than just China and more than the last 2 elections. So I know the focus with inquiries is to keep it as narrow as possible. How broad do you think this goes, and what is there a mechanism? Is it a royal commission? Is it something like we just saw with Judge Rouleau? What's the best way to get at it, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know the particulars of the case, so I'm not really comfortable recommending one over the other. I think the principles are more important than the actual instrument at this stage, which is to get this out of the hands of the to and fro partisan politics in the media cycle, and to take a cold hard look on the threats that Canada faces that are different from what we've faced in the past, and develop institutional strength to deal with those threats. That's the way to maintain positive support for democratic institutions over the long term. And that's the key thing, right? There's been lots of ink spilled about how this is good for one party or good for another party. What foreign actors, in particular countries like China and Russia, are interested in is eroding citizens' faith in their democratic institutions over time, regardless of who is in power, because that makes whoever that is, it makes it more difficult for them to act in the national self-interest. So I think it's really important that we try and get this out of the realm of politics.
So you played a key role in the 2015 and the 2019 Liberal election campaigns. Were you ever aware or presented with any examples of foreign interference in those campaigns?
No, I think, sorry, I thought you were going to ask me about the specific case, which I absolutely was not briefed on the stories that were in Global. I think that we were always made aware that there was the potential for foreign interference, in particular after the 2016 presidential election campaign in the United States. But no, I was never given an example of this is how country A is interfering in our elections. We were always told that it was a possibility.
Okay,
and to a certain degree, as a G7 country, Canadians should be insulted if adversarial countries aren't trying to interfere in our elections. It's a reflection of our status around important multilateral tables that this would be happening.
Right. Well, I did want to ask you about the specific allegations in the Global reporting, because it's about a specific MP. It's about Han Dong in Don Valley North, and the allegation is that China stacked the nomination to get him elected in the hopes that it would give them influence and maybe he would be sympathetic to their cause. And the reporting is that CSIS raised this with the Liberal campaign and advised against allowing him to run. Do you know anything about that particular allegation from your time with the party? And would CSIS typically make that sort of a recommendation to campaigns about candidates?
Well, no and no. I certainly was not briefed about this, and I have no knowledge of anybody else in the campaign being briefed about it either. When I left the Prime Minister's office in February of 2019, I would have surrendered my security clearance at that time, so I would not have been briefed anyway. As for the specific circumstances, therefore, I can't really comment on it. And I find it really hard to believe, because it's not what CSIS does, that they would make any kind of policy recommendation to the government. It's not their function in the system. Their function is to make policymakers and their supporting public service staff, first and foremost, aware of any potential threats. It's not to then make recommendations about what to do about those threats.
Okay, the Prime Minister was asked today about having an inquiry, and he says they're going to make David Morrison, Jody Thomas, people who have advised him on national security, run now in senior positions in global affairs, they're going to appear before a parliamentary committee. So it's going to be left to that partisan stacked body as opposed to the independent public inquiry of some sort that you're advocating. How do you think that's going to go? And what advice would you give the Prime Minister if he were to seek it from you on how to deal with this?
Well, I think it's, as you know, David, I'm not in the business of giving, I don't backseat drive my former colleagues and my former boss. But I do think in this case, there's an extraordinary issue at stake, and that is the long-term health of our democratic institutions. I know Jody Thomas and David Morrison very well. They're incredible, upstanding public servants, full of integrity. If you were to look up ideal Canadian public servant in if there were such an entry in the Canadian Encyclopedia, you could very well find each of their pictures there. But sometimes sending people into a partisan environment like that is not going to accomplish what you hope it's going to accomplish. And you really do need to take a step back and take a deeper look. I think the media is always asking the government to reach across partisan lines and do things that are in the public interest of the country. I think this is a ripe opportunity to do just that.
Okay, Jerry Butts, thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you, David. It's great to be here.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is unequivocal. The overall 2019 and 2021 election results were not impacted by foreign interference. That's in response to a number of news reports that say China attempted to meddle in both elections. Trudeau pointed to the Special Election Task Force responsible for monitoring those elections. And in both cases, that task force determined the results were not compromised. Senator Ian Shugart is a former clerk of the Privy Council. He also served on the Security and Intelligence Threat to Election Task Force for the 2019 election. Senator, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure, David.
So you wouldn't have any knowledge of what happened with the 2021 election because you weren't on the committee then, but you were in 2019. And I wonder, given some of the allegations that have been raised about Chinese interference, was your committee presented with clear evidence of foreign interference in the 2019 election?
We were presented with evidence of the involvement and the interest of Chinese agents, forces, entities in our political process as far back as 2019. So the clear answer is yes. And as the clerk, I chaired that panel, which I think it's important that people understand was created exclusively for the election period under what we have in Canada is known as the Caretaker Convention, where precisely because there's an election and to remove the government of the day from decisions that could affect the outcome of the election, the affairs day to day are left to senior public servants and to the public service and to the institutions of our government. And it was in that capacity that we created the panel. And as soon as the election is over, the panel's mandate is done because the government, we've got a political result and the government is back in office. So we had evidence during the election period of interest and involvement. We did not have evidence of involvement on a scale or of a nature that would have affected the outcome of the 2019 election.
So help me understand that, Senator, when you say that. So there's evidence of attempts to be involved, but it wouldn't affect the outcome. Does that mean the total outcome, this is what we're talking about here, wouldn't have changed the result from a Liberal victory, but what's the threshold for going public? What if it's one riding that was flipped or two ridings that were flipped potentially because of this? What's the threshold for disclosing that level of activity, and is that what you saw?
It's a really good question, and in some ways it's the heart of the matter of what's going on currently. And in fact, it's the heart of the matter of intelligence, information, and operations quite apart from elections. And it's a tough question for the intelligence agencies and for the government 365 days of the year. But let me answer this way. It's always a hypothetical situation. Yes, we would have been prepared to intervene and to go public and alert the public of a situation had it arisen, even on the basis of one or two ridings, or if something had been national in its scope. It would have depended on the nature of the intervention. But we need to understand that often intelligence information is partial, and it is incomplete in the sense that you have indications of interest, but it stops well short of having any effect. Do you intervene because the other side is interested, and even that the other side may be at work? No, you don't necessarily, because you may simply want to gather more evidence, or you might not have evidence that is clear enough about what their intentions are. So the intelligence agencies watch, and they pay attention, and they continue to gather information. But we on the panel, at no point in the 2019 election, were presented with information that said, this has the potential to distort things in such a way that the outcome of the election, either locally or nationally, could be affected. But our mandate, our remit, would have allowed us to do interventions on either scale, either local or national.
Okay, so that's an important distinction. So in the 2019 campaign, you didn't even see the potential for a single riding to be flipped by the intelligence information that you were presented with. Am I correct in understanding that?
Not as I recall. We had no information. Sometimes you inform a campaign of interest by outside entities, let's call them that, and ask them to be alert. But at no point did we have information, even that one riding had the potential to be flipped, to use your term.
How should Canadians reconcile this, sir, in that you were presented with information of interest, to use your word, but nothing that rose to the level of concern that even a single riding could have been influenced in a way that the final result changed? With the reporting and the concerns we're seeing now of this sophisticated efforts allegedly by the Chinese government in the past two elections, how do Canadians reconcile that?
Well, I cannot speak to the 2021 election, but I certainly have the impression that things developed over that period of time. And we will have, as I understand it, fairly soon, the report of the panel regarding the 2021 election. So we will learn more at that point, presumably. All I can tell you is that it is a delicate and sometimes inexact science, what the agencies do with the information that they have. But there is a real risk in going too far too fast with information if you don't have a solid enough basis. For example, in interventions or involvement, interference that might involve criminal activities, you want to be very clear that you've got enough evidence before you spring the trap and actually take criminal consequences, actions in regard to that intervention, that interference. So that's the difficulty. That's the sensitivity with this kind of information. You can be aware that there is interest, that there is the beginnings of interference, but it has not yet gotten to the point where you can know definitively where it's going, what the purpose is, how it is going to play out. And we had no evidence that it was actually affecting the outcome of the campaign.
Just a final question. Given the how do I explain this? Given the challenges around intelligence versus it not being evidence, and given what you said, that it's your sense that since 2019 things may have escalated to a significant degree, and where we are now in the public reporting and in the public commentary around this, what do you make of the calls for an inquiry into this? Do you think this is something that the government should consider, a nonpartisan public inquiry into election interference?
I think the government, any government at any time, should be as transparent as possible, as clear about the information that is known as possible. And I would even venture to say that at this time, the government should err on the side of transparency. And some of our colleagues in the intelligence agencies might shudder at the thought of erring on the side of transparency, but I think it's important. But it's in the nature of intelligence information that much of that information can never see the light of day because of operational sensitivity. And I won't go into all of what operational sensitivity involves. We can do that another time, or there are others that are better placed to do that. But it is very real. And it has to do with sometimes the partiality, the incompleteness of the information. Sometimes it has to do with people who are vulnerable to action by the other side if you divulge the information. The other thing I would say, David, is that we have entities that have been set up precisely for the purpose of oversight of our intelligence agencies. The National Security Intelligence Review Agency does its work all the time with respect to oversight of the methods and the proper business of the intelligence agencies. And then we've got the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which is not the same as a parliamentary committee, which admittedly gets pretty partisan. This is a committee of parliamentarians who are sworn to secrecy, who have the privilege of access to documents that give them the ability to oversee the conduct of our agencies. My inclination is that while an inquiry might do useful work, there is still going to be a very substantial amount of information that they are not going to be able to divulge to the Canadian public. And there is still going to be in some quarters an appetite for that information. I'm afraid that appetite in large measure can never be satisfied, which is why we have these two entities to provide institutional oversight of our intelligence agencies.
Okay, Ian Sugar, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.